Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. We're back on our 355 project, and today's video is going to be focused on one of the more unique and very cool features of these 355s, and that is the independent throttle bodies. Today, I'm going to run you guys through the procedure to synchronize or adjust them after we've completed all of our major service work. So we're off the heels of our last video where we reinstalled the engine and, well, went through the first fire up the car, fired right on up, ran, idled great, and I only let the car run that one initial heat cycle, so it was about 30-40 minutes of pretty much just idle time. Let everything come to temperature, let everything equalize, double checked my fluid levels, and really that was the end of the day and my work week, so I shut the car off, walked away from it, and, well, we're back out here today and sat for the weekend. Now I have gone over the car, I raised it up, took and got my eyes underneath the car, made sure I had no leaks, nothing's out of place, my belts aren't rubbing. I really just made sure everything is exactly how it should be, where it should be at. I've also gone through and checked my fluid levels, and everything was good, except my coolant. It was actually a little bit low, so I had to add a little bit of coolant in there. It was still showing in our main expansion tank, our reservoir, but it was towards the bottom. And when I fill the coolant up cold, I want it to be about right there on the reservoir is my ideal spot. I'd say that's probably down to there. So I topped that back off. We should be set on that fluid level, and I'm going to leave the car cold. We'll do a cold start on it here, let it warm up, and then once it's up to temp, we'll jump into the procedure for the independent throttle bodies. So in my opinion, anytime a 355 goes through a timing belt change or its major service, the throttle should be synchronized. Now, if the car is kept up really well and this has gone through, they usually aren't too far out, and they require just small little adjustments to get them fine-tuned. But a lot of times I'll get these cars, do the service, and you'll find that they're wildly out of adjustment. Now, I feel that this adjustment is so critical because the engine ECU and fuel injectors are going to be putting the same amount of fuel in for each cylinder no matter what. They're not able to adjust or tailor the fuel based on the needs of each cylinder. It's essentially a bank that's going to be getting that adjustment, bank 1 versus bank 2. If our throttles aren't synchronized properly, we're going to have different vacuum and or more or less airflow going into each cylinder. And if all those cylinders are getting the same amount of fuel, that means our air-fuel ratio is across the board on all these independent throttle bodies. Now, we all know that heat is a big issue and really one of the main killers and contributing factors to the exhaust manifold failures that 355 see. So if we're running a cylinder incredibly lean, we're going to be putting a lot of heat in there, and down the road, long term, it's going to have a negative effect on our headers. So this adjustment is definitely going to have an effect on how well the car idles, the revs drop, how well your revs increase, the smoothness of it, maybe depending on how wildly out of spec they are, have an effect on power. But ultimately, it's kind of a proactive measure to be sure that the engine is running as it should, we're not creating excess heat, and we're not doing further damage to things like the manifolds, the valve guides, the catalytic converters, all weak points of a 355. So before we really get into this, I will say that this procedure is probably going to be tricky for the average do-it-yourselfer at home, and that's only because of the tools that are needed. You're going to need some special tools or equipment. It's going to take a bit of an investment to have those tools, and depending on how many cars you service, if it's just your one car or you do a lot of cars, your return on investment may or may not be worth it, so it could be hard to justify the tool yourself up to do this job by yourself. So speaking of tools, I'm going to walk you guys through the tools that I use in order to get the throttles balanced on the 355. Starting with our adjustment screwdriver. I looked at this earlier and I couldn't find a part number on the shaft. I will go back when I'm editing this video and I'll dig up the part number for this and post it in the video for you. But it is a Blue Point carburetor screwdriver. So just twist the top and I make this adjustment. These are pretty inexpensive, and this is a pretty basic tool that I think any of us would be willing to invest to do this ourselves, and it really does the bulk of work for all of our adjustments on the throttle bodies for this car. Now, another thing that we're going to need is we're going to need something to read RPM off of the car, preferably a digital display. We're going to need something a little bit more precise than the tachometer in the car, and we're going to be back here doing all of our adjustments. We're not going to be able to keep looking up into the car for that, so your best bet is having some sort of scan tool where you can get a digital readout of your RPM. I say this because there is a spec for the RPM we want the engine at, which is 1020 RPM, and as you make adjustments through these bleed screws and your throttle bodies, you might raise or lower your RPM of the engine, and you have to adjust that accordingly so everything is equalized at that RPM. So when it comes to tools, I do have this Autel scanner, and this one is a Maxi Pro MP808BT Pro. Essentially, this is one of the least expensive models that lists it as having Ferrari coverage. So this lists that it will communicate with a 355 with an ME 5.2 ECU, which is what our car has. However, I will tell you, it does not. If I go into any of the Ferrari specific software for the Bosch 5.2 for the Motronic, that ECU will not communicate. Now, I was trying to communicate with that scan tool through the OBD2 port, and on this generation of car with Ferrari, we don't use those for any of the factory tools, so that wasn't a total surprise to me. So I got an adapter, which if you see right here, has our 3-pin adapter, which plugs into our ISO line back at our Motronic, and has an adapter for the OBD2. So that way it was going to allow me to plug the scan tool in directly at the Motronic in the same fashion that the factory has. Now that adapter is like a Fiat or Alfa Romeo adapter. They're pretty inexpensive. You can just shop around and find those. That as well did not work with that scan tool. Now, I could use that scan tool in either the OBD2 port or at the ECU ISO connector and go in generically with an OBD2 scan, and it did read faults out of the module. I was able to get parameters, and it did show me RPM. I also do have some other, variants for OBD2 scanners with different dongles and like an app on my phone, and I kind of have a bunch of different ones, and essentially is what I found, or my opinion on these is most of these manufacturers are using the same bootleg software on these devices, and that's really where the problem lies. These work okay-ish on newer cars when you get up into like the 430s, 458s, stuff like that. They work okay. I still don't really trust them, but they're inexpensive, and for the average guy at home, it kind of works. Not the greatest. Now, I'm fortunate over here that I was able recently to pick up a SD1 clone. So I have, let me get this booted up here. You can see that it's a laptop that's running all the SD1 software, and it has this emulator box, which is a clone of an actual SD1 that lets me go in and communicate with the car. You can see I have it hooked up here to our ISO line on our Motronic. This is what I was talking about with that little pigtail, and this is how we're going to communicate with the car. Now, the cost of that SD1 is far above and beyond what I think any one of you guys at home that's just doing this on your own car is going to want to invest in and pay for. However, for myself, it's an easy choice because I need the factory level coverage, and I like working with the tools that I'm used to. So we're going to be using that simply to read RPM. You don't have to use it. You can use a generic OBD2 scanner, or even if you have a nice digital timing light that can read RPM, you can actually take the timing light, throw it on one of the spark plug wires, and that as well can give you your RPM. And like I mentioned, we're going to be set up back here at the back of the car doing our adjustments. So I'm actually going to end up bringing the cart over here and setting it in this area. And that's going to allow me to be back here and just glance at my readout to be sure I'm at that RPM. Need to make it quick and easy and accessible because our eyes are going to be on our mercury column most of the time. And this is really the most critical tool of this job, which we're going to be using to get everything synchronized and adjusted. Now, this is going to be hard to replicate at home unless you are willing to invest a fair amount of money. I can tell you that in order to just find these mercury columns that I used for this with, believe it or not, actual mercury, I Google searched off and on kind of casually for 3 years before I actually found a company and a website that had them. I immediately purchased them, and they're made for motorcycles essentially, so they're just made for 4 cylinders. So I ordered 3 kits. And I can tell you that I was skeptical all the way up until the moment I had them in my hands. I thought there was no way that I was actually going to get them with the actual mercury in them. Lo and behold, they did, and I was tickled to death because that was one thing that I was worried about on how am I going to get over this problem? What am I going to use for this exact situation? So I bought some bulk metal. I made this plate. I have these mounted on here, and you can see all the vacuum hose off the back side. I brought them all the way through the top so that way they dangle on the bottom so it's just a little bit more stable. Everything's mounted up, just some spark plug wire separators there. This is kind of my initial version of the tool. I had to build this to get it good enough to use it on this 355. I think eventually I'm going to frame this off, or I'd like to, and enclose it and enclose the back side so that way I don't have to worry about it getting so dusty and trying to clean it. There's a lot of nooks and crevices in here. These tubes are a little bit fragile. I've already broke a couple of them and had to order replacements. This is going to be tricky now. I've only done this procedure on a 355 with a mercury column. I've never used or tried to use a digital gauge or like an analog vacuum gauge. So I don't know how well that would work, because I know for at idle, when we're making our adjustments for our initial vacuum pull, it would be easy to get everything calibrated. But we are going to be doing some sweeps with the engine and bringing it through the RPM range. And it's not so much the reading that I need on the mercury, meaning how much vacuum I'm pulling. It's the rise of all the cylinders in relation to one another, which this is just a very quick, easy visual tool where I can put my eyes on it and see that, yep, everything's equal and everything's balanced. And with a digital gauge or an analog gauge, I think that's going to be incredibly tough. So I admittedly have more invested in this than I really needed to, but that's because I wanted to make it a permanent, long-lasting tool. I could have not bought this stand. I upgraded this silicone hose with it because it came with this real thin hose up here, which I wasn't really fond of. So, I could have just bought these mercury columns, screwed them to a piece of wood, and I would have been set. Used the hose that it came with and it would have got through. It would have made do for me. But I wanted to make something a little bit more permanent, a little bit longer lasting. So that is my ultimate setup. And again, I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle for you guys at home, although it's doable. Just a matter of how much you want to invest into it. So we all know that the goal here is to synchronize all the throttle bodies. There is one very important thing to keep in mind when you're doing this procedure that I see confuse some people, and they kind of start to chase their tail. The thing to remember is we cannot increase vacuum. We can only decrease vacuum. So when we're making our adjustments on the car, if I have a cylinder that has a lot of vacuum and one that does not have a lot of vacuum, there's no way that I can take the cylinder that does not have a lot of vacuum and increase it. I can only bring the cylinder that has a lot of vacuum down to match the other cylinders. So keeping that in mind tells us where the focus on our adjustments and which cylinders we need to adjust. And I have seen it where people gonna get confused by that, because when you're running it on your mercury column here and you see your cylinders that are a lot stronger, they're going to be pulling a lot more vacuum up on them. And I don't know, I think it's kind of like a mind trick where they see that one's higher, then they start focusing on that or the other ones to bring it up the match, not realizing that you have to bring it down to the low ones. So I will say, like everything else on this car, like when we did the camshaft timing, that the factory workshop manual is terrible in my opinion, and it does not describe this process very well. For the throttle balance, it's really bad. And years ago, I read through the procedure, I did a balance on a car, and I essentially took what the factory was trying to say, or at least my interpretation of that, wrote it down in my own words on a cheat sheet, so that way it's just far more straightforward on how to run through this procedure. And this is something I did so all the other guys in the workshop could use it as well, because especially for the new technicians, it was really hard for them to get their mind wrapped around it. So my cheat sheet that I have has the factory picture of our throttles with all of the different areas of note of the bleed ports we're going to pull vacuum off of, our adjustment screws, and all the adjustment screws in the center of the engine in the valley. So I will say that where we're at on this is going to be a little bit different than what I'm doing today, and that really starts with step one. On step one, it says screw in all the bleed screws all the way, number one. So these screws right here, where it says number one, are the screws that we use to adjust how much vacuum each cylinder has, or I should say, the screws we use to decrease how much vacuum each cylinder has. So this is essentially an air bypass screw that's on the top side of the throttle plate. As we screw this screw out, it's going to allow more air to flow through of a channel down underneath the throttle plate into the cylinder, thus reducing the vacuum. That's why I said we only can reduce it, we can't increase it. So this is saying for step one to screw them all in, all the way, which makes sense because then we're going to take the strong cylinders down to the weak cylinders. However, on this particular car, I have not done that because I have never serviced this car before. This is my first time going through it, and I want to hook the car up with my mercury columns and see how well they are adjusted, so that way I can tell the client, like, hey, the car was dialed in last time it was serviced, you had someone working on it that knew what they're doing a great job, or hey, they weren't good, and I can show them that tangible difference and show them where we set it to. Now I will say that everything I've seen on this car, it was dialed in. The cam timing was pretty much dialed in, so I'm hopeful that when we get to our mercury columns and get them hooked up, that it's going to be dialed in as well, because That's what I love to see. I love to see the cars that are being serviced by a skilled hand, a skilled craftsman, and being serviced right, even though it may not be me doing the work. So, back to our instructions. It's essentially saying screw all the bleed screws in. So we just talked about that. Then it's talking about unscrewing the set screws here on both sides, cylinder 6, item 6. These set screws are on the center of the valley. We're going to unscrew those essentially so that way we know that there's basically this linkage is not acting on the throttles and they're all in their natural resting position. So we back them off at the beginning of this procedure and then we readjust them back to where they need to be at the end of the procedure. The next step is to install our mercury columns, sure, and then unplug the idle valve. So if you have a Bosch 5.2 car, you're going to have one idle valve disconnected. If you have an ME 2.7 car, two idle valves, they both need to be disconnected, and we're going to leave them disconnected throughout this entire service. Will cause a check engine light that you are going to have to clear, but that's fine. Just make sure they're unplugged, and you'll clear the faults when you're done. So with that, the next thing is to adjust our RPM to 1020. Now there's two ways to do this. We can use it by the adjustment of the throttle cable nut or the set screws. I personally prefer the throttle cable nut. It's quick and easy, and it's just the method I usually go for. But this is what I mentioned earlier. We're going to set our engine at as close as we can get it to 1020 RPM. There's another important thing to note, and that's the cooling fans. While we're doing this procedure, you're going to hear the cooling fans cycle on and off. Typically, when they cycle on, we're going to see a change in our engine RPM. So we're going to be sure that we set our engine RPM to when our cooling fans are off, and all of our main adjustments that we're going to rely on our mercury columns, we're going to be doing all those final adjustments when the fans are off. So I will still adjust when my fans are on just to save time, but when I'm really trying to dial it and get it perfect and consider it, yes, it is adjusted where I need to be, I only do so when the fans are off. There's no way around it. The fans are going to cycle. Sometimes I have taken a small little shop fan and used that to blow air into the radiators to help minimize the amount of cycles on the fan to kind of simulate some airflow through the radiators. They make it a little bit easier for myself. But if you don't have the access to do that or tools, just keep in mind, when the fans are on, the engine RPM is going to change. It's not really the best state that the engine in or the car is in to make your measurements. Wait till they're off. So our next steps are really the bulk of our adjustment. And it's saying pair the minimum vacuum on cylinders 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 with set screw number 3. So this set screw right here, number 3, which is a vertical screw right on top, you'll see it right up there. What this is saying is we're going to find out of, this is cylinders 1 and 2. We're going to pick which cylinder has the minimum vacuum, whichever one it is. And this is 3 and 4, whichever one has the minimum vacuum. And we're going to pair those two minimum vacuums to be equal. We're going to use this screw right on top to make that adjustment. So we're basically pairing our minimums from each cast throttle body. If you guys recall, when I was assembling this engine, these throttle bodies are cast in pairs, meaning this is one shaft connected to these two throttle plates. This is one shaft to these two throttle plates. So this screw number 3 is going to adjust the relationship, essentially, of these two shafts between the throttles. So we're going to run that procedure on bank 1 and bank 2. I should have mentioned this is the front of the car in this picture. So once we have the minimum vacuum from these two paired throttle bodies synchronized, we can actually go in and start adjusting number 1, which is our idle bleed valve, which has that air bypass to below the throttle. And we're going to take our strongest cylinder that has a lot of vacuum, and we're going to bleed that vacuum off so it equalizes the other one, or the one with the lowest vacuum. And then we're going to do the same to the other pair. And after that step, essentially all 4 are equalized and synchronized. Then we're going to come over and do the same thing to the other bank. So you can see pair minimum vacuum on 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, screw number 3, and then adjust screw number 1 to equalize the cylinder pairs. Now, I guess you could adjust screw number 1 to equalize the cylinder pairs, then go and equalize the pairs of throttle bodies bank to bank. I was reading back through this to refresh myself, and I'm like, well, you could do it differently. I don't know if it would have an effect on it, and obviously it's been so long since I made this list, I don't know why I made it in that order. But I suppose you could do it. It's really, at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to have an effect on your ultimate adjustment. However, I'm going to do this car in the way that I wrote this instruction because maybe there's a reason why I did it this way and I don't remember it. So back to this. Now, it's telling us to adjust screw number 2 to balance bank 1 and bank 2. So screw number 2 is over here, and this is the leverage that this rod right here is working on to adjust this linkage. So at that point, we're adjusting our banks so they're equal from bank to bank. And you can see here I have a note, we're going to want to rev the car. If the vacuum is uneven, adjust screw number 4 to equalize the banks. So screw number 4, where is it at? Right here on the outside of bank 2. Now what I mean by that is we've adjusted everything for idle, but we want to bring the RPM up and make sure that the cycle or the opening rate of the throttles is equal. So if we have everything where they're balanced dead nuts on, and then we rev the car up and we see that one bank is dragging behind the other bank, we're going to use screw number 4 to adjust that so that way both banks rise equally. This is what I was talking about earlier when I was saying I don't know how well a digital or an analog gauge would work versus a mercury column, because when I do these sweeps, I don't care what my vacuum rating is. I care that all of them are equal and increasing and decreasing at the same time. And watching the column of mercury go up and down is very easy and visual, but I think watching a digital gauge, you're going to be trying to read 4 different things, or an analog gauge, you're trying to read 4 different things versus I'm looking for an equal plane. So this is where this tool comes in and really shines. So we have that where it says equalize both banks, and then the last thing we do is adjust screw number 6. These are these screws here that we backed out at the very beginning. So they just touch the housings but don't act on the throttle. And then the last notes are readjust the throttle cable, plug in your idle valve, and obviously you're going to clear your faults. So I know there's a lot there. I'm going to run through it in detail when we're on the car doing it, but I wanted to run through the procedure before we have the noise of the car going on and we're actually doing the adjustment. Now I will take you guys down here and show you. You can see I still have all the wheel wells and liners out, and this is really where I have all the access to do my work to actually hook up our vacuum lines, but I won't do any adjustment when the car is running down here because we talked about it. You got this header right here, you got this fan blowing all the heat from the radiator and oil cooler plus the header. It's just going to be far too hot. All right, so space is tight in here, but I pulled the injector off, and if you look right there where I'm pointing with my tool, that is the bleed port that we adjust for our throttles. Now, this is for cylinder 2, so for cylinder 1, it's actually pointing straight at me, and it's behind these rubber hoses. So to actually get to these, I have to run my tool in between the hoses, and you can see that I haven't ran in. And if you guys can envision here, if I'm on the top side of the car, you can see how this tool works out great. So what I'm trying to show you guys is where these ports are. We have these rubber hoses here to contend with, and you can see that, maybe someone could come down here and adjust them through the wheel well, but it's going to be pretty hot and I would say virtually unbearable. So this tool here is really key because it fits great. It's like it's almost made for this job. Now that we're down here also, if you look right here, this is our bleed port on either side on each throttle. So you can see that these are pointing towards each other for cylinder 2 and cylinder 3. And these have an 8mm on them. You can see that it's already kind of loose because I cracked them free and spun them open a little bit. This is where our vacuum hoses for our mercury columns go on. I will say that if you're doing a timing belt service and you have the engine out, crack these loose before you put the engine back in the car because space is pretty tight, especially for cylinder 1. If you look at cylinder 4 right here, it actually runs straight out and hits this rubber hose for our vent line right out of our valve cover. So it's hard to get a socket on. All the other ones you can get a deep socket on. This one you have to get a wrench, but you can see that there's not a lot of space to get them cracked free. And sometimes if they're really seized tight, like if they haven't been adjusted in a long time, it's going to be a bit of a struggle, and you're going to be grateful that you did so when the engine was still apart. All right, so we went through where the adjustment screw is on the throttle bodies for our air bleed and where we're going to hook our vacuum hoses up on. Now this is really important. When you hook these hoses up, make sure you hook them on the correct port. So I'm going to do so where this is cylinder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That's how I'm going to have all mine hooked up, so that when I'm reading it, I know how. So you're going to be sure that you get these hoses put on the right port. Now you can see I got the car raised up just a couple feet, and that is because I find it easier to have the car in this position to install my hoses because it's not so high where I can actually run my hoses up over into the car, but then I can actually come into the wheel wells and get them connected. This is one reason why I wait, if I can, to have a cold engine to hook everything up. It is so much nicer versus a hot engine, but again, it all just kind of comes down to my workflow in the days if I'm able to do that. So I'm going to get the mercury column hooked up. I usually keep it over here on the passenger side. I'm going to drape them over the car, get them hooked up on bank 1. I'll drape them over the engine. I'll get them hooked up over here on bank 2. Again, from our wheel wells, I'll get those hooked up. Then I'm going to lower the car down, and then we're going to get access, because you can see our coolant expansion tank and a lot of the adjustments we need to get to are down underneath of it. So we need to get that propped out of the way so we have access. So I'm going to get everything set up, hooked up, and then we're going to crack this thing off and start going through the procedure. All right, everything is set up and we're pretty much ready to go. So I just used some zip ties to get that coolant expansion tank as much out of the way as possible. And since we have that out of the way, I'll grab a light, drop you guys down in here. So angle it so you can see it. This is the screw number 6 right there that we're going to back out so it's not resting on this housing. Now on the other side, that screw is the forward one, not the rear one. The rear one right here, that screw, and it's forward on this side, that screw's number 2, and that's what we use to equalize the pairs of throttle bodies on either side. Granted, the way I view it is there's, yes, 4 throttle bodies on each side of the engine, but there's 2 shafts. So we're really synchronizing those. So keep in mind that that adjustment, everything's in pairs, right? That's a pair, that's a pair, this is a pair of these 2, and these 2. So we're synchronizing those. One thing to note, I have not adjusted or made any changes to the throttle cable since I've worked on the car. And you can actually see, I'm trying to get in here so I'm not blocking it, that it's actually quite a bit too loose. There's a lot of slack in that cable. And the customer had some complaints of the throttle. He didn't really like the way it felt, which is kind of a common complaint on 355s. But that's one thing we will take care of for him. But I cracked these jam nuts loose right here. They're loose, so once the car is up and running, I can tighten those jam nuts in, open the throttle just enough to hit our desired RPM. Now the only other thing that's worth mentioning, which I don't even know if I'm going to be able to show you, is right there is our screw that we're going to use to adjust this bank to bank 1. That screw is sitting vertically, and I usually just use a wrench to get to it. There's really no visibility of it, but it's right there vertically. And there's also another one over here on the other side. So it's pretty tight. And as I mentioned, once this is running, leaning over this with all the heat, it's pretty terrible. So all of our lines are on for each cylinder. You can see I got the mercury columns here. Threw a camera on it, so hopefully I can capture it for you guys and have some good footage. I have a couple other cameras stashed around. I'm hopeful to capture this well so that way you guys can see what I'm doing with my tooling and the adjustments that we're making. Although I fear that it's going to be pretty tough because of just placement, lack of visibility. I'm going to do my best. I don't know how it's going to turn out, but we'll see. So, one thing that is important to note is the mercury column. You can see I'm right here for bank 1, so I have access. I'm going to be standing right here making my adjustments, and I want it to be pretty easy where I can look and see my mercury column right here. And bank 2 is quite a bit easier because we can look across the car. We're going to be right here, and we have a dead on shot. And you can see I have my tester back here where I'll have a pretty easy view of RPM. Not that great, but not too bad. Giving myself a little bit of room to walk around. All of the lines are on. So we're going to fire this thing off. I'm going to let it come to temperature. Once it's up to temperature, I'm going to probably bring you guys back and show you what we have for the initial adjustment and synchronization. And then we'll go and back our screws off on our throttles. We'll unplug our idle valve, and then we'll start running through the procedure. All right, so it's running and up to temperature, and I have to give it to the last guy that worked on this car. When he ran through the cam timing, it was dead nuts on spec. And I'll bring you guys around and show you our mercury columns here. And you can see this is bank 1 right here. A little bit of unevenness. Bank 2 is pretty much dialed. This car is pretty well set. Now granted, I've made no adjustments to anything yet. The idle valve is still plugged in. So this will change a little bit once we unplug the idle valve. But I've seen a lot worse, frequently a lot worse. So it's just nice to see, even though I'm going through and double checking everything, that this car was serviced at a very high level. It was done right with the last guy who did it, so props on him. Now, with that being said though, I'm still going to run back through this procedure see if we can't get this any better, a little bit tighter. So I'm gonna go unplug my idle valve. I'm gonna screw in all of my air bypass screws, and then I'm gonna adjust my throttle to get it at 1020. And then once we get to that point, I'm gonna walk you guys through the procedure of getting these synchronized. All right, I have all of the bleed screws screwed all the way in. The idle valve is unplugged. We've been bouncing around 1040, 1050, 1020 RPM, but honestly, I have the throttle loose. So in order to get the RPM to go down any further, I'd have to adjust or back off number 6 on my housings. But since we're currently dead on, I'm just gonna leave those for now. So we have these, number 1, on all of them screwed all the way in. And I'll bring you guys over to our Mercury column. And this car is actually pretty dialed in, even with what we've done now. All right, so looking at this, we're gonna focus on bank 2 because that's where everything's set up right now. You can see 7 or 8 are my lowest vacuum, 5 and 6 are a little bit higher. If you remember, I need to pair the throttle shafts to each other first. That means I need to pair the lowest vacuum on 7 and 8 to the lowest vacuum on 5 and 6. So our lowest vacuum looks like it's cylinder 8, and over here it looks like it's cylinder 5. So I need to go back to the screws on the linkage and equalize those two pairs. Essentially, I need to drop my vacuum down from 5 and 6 to match number 8. Now this screw that we're going to be adjusting is the one that's sitting vertical up on this linkage. So with that, I'm going to set you guys down. I'm going to grab a wrench and I'm going to start bringing number 5 back to match number 8. Alright, so I decided to pull the set screw 6 out, and now my RPM, my idle dropped down to 930. So I'm going to adjust the throttle cable to bring it up to 1020. Alright, so the set screws number 6 are back all the way out. Throttle linkage is adjusted, so I'm at 1020 RPM. Now I'm going to adjust number 3 in the center to equalize the two pairs of throttles between number 5 and 6, 7 and 8. Alright, we're pretty close, but now you can see that it looks like 6 is the lowest one, and the lowest one in the other car is 8. So we got 5 and 8 pretty equal, but now I'm going to work the same screw to bring 6 equal to 8, go back through that procedure. Now when I was doing it, the idle speed did come up because I opened it up so much, so I had to go back to my cable adjustment and bring the idle speed back down. We'll make another adjustment and see if we can get this equalized. Alright, we're at bouncing between 950, 1020, 1030. So we're set on our RPM. And I got our lowest over here matching. So we have cylinder 6, cylinder 8 are matching. And on bank 1, we're actually good. 1 and 3 are our lowest and they're matching. So now we need to go to the bleed screws number 1 on the outside of the throttles. We need to adjust those out to bleed down vacuum on the high cylinder. So this one's to be cylinder 2 and probably 4, and over here probably 5 and 7, and is what we're going to aim for, is a straight line all the way across on those. So again, set you guys down and make those adjustments. All right, move over. So over here, looks like cylinder 2 is really high and cylinder 4. So we're going to start by bringing cylinder 2 to match 1 and 3. Alright, so I made the adjustments on the throttle bodies, bringing the ones with high vacuum down to match the pairs with low vacuum. Now this effectively equalized the banks across the board. So if you look at our mercury column here, you can see that we're virtually a straight line. Same thing on bank 2. However, you're going to notice that I have less vacuum on bank 1 than I do on bank 2. So I'm going to be acting on this screw back here, this back second screw, to make that adjustment to equalize the two banks. But I'm gonna have to set you down because I'm gonna need both hands. Alright, there we have it. You can see that we're pretty dang near level across the top. Everything's equalized. Now I will tell you that this engine does not like to be revved with the idle valve unplugged. So I'm going to plug the idle valve back in, clear the errors out of it. Then we're going to slowly rev it to make sure that everything stays the same and is equalized. One thing to note, when I was equalizing bank to bank, I was opening up the throttles on one side, and that was actually driving my RPM up quite a bit, so I had to keep going back, bringing my RPM down, go back, make an adjustment, bring my RPM down, and you kind of have to like circle in until you get it zoned in and locked in. So let's get that idle valve plugged in, which we should just be able to do back over here. Find the connector, put that in, and we'll come over here, get our errors cleared out of this. Go back. You can see our idle picked up. It's running a lot better and very equal. Now, one thing to note on these mercury columns, they do move quite a bit as the engine's running. So you can't really like say if you're right on a line. You can't pick the line and make it perfect. You're kind of looking for an average. As they go up and down, I'm looking for the average of that whole bank to be equal, not the exact dead spot. All right, so we're gonna bring some RPM up. We're gonna watch the sweep of our gauges, make sure they're pretty consistent, and see where we're at on our adjustment. Alright, I think we got it. Alright, so really not too bad to get the throttles balanced. You can see that it takes a little bit of fine tuning, so don't go into it thinking that you're going to make one adjustment on a screw and that's the only time you adjust it. The best way I can describe it is it's like a spiral, and you're just getting closer and closer to the center as you make your adjustments, meaning you're going to go around and make the same adjustments multiple times, but your amount of change is less and less and less until there's almost no change on it. All right, so remember, we cannot increase vacuum, we can only reduce it. Also, we know it has 8 individual throttle bodies and we're adjusting each one of those 8 throttle bodies. It only has 4 shafts. So if we split that in half where you're working on one bank, you're going to pick the lowest vacuum on the rear set of throttles with the shaft and the lowest vacuum on the set of throttles with the other shaft on the front and equalize those two. Then we're going to bring the strong cylinders on each set of throttles on each individual shaft down the match, and that should have us all on the same plane, and then we're just going to match bank to bank. Essentially, you're dividing it into smaller groups, adjusting those smaller groups, working your way out until the entire engine is balanced. Now be sure to keep an eye on your RPM as you make adjustments. The engine's going to fluctuate as the engine RPM comes up or down. It's going to change your readings on the mercury column, so you don't want to chase your tail on that. You want to be consistent. Make sure all the adjustments you make are at the same idle speed. Make sure that the cooling fans are off. Keep everything the same so everything's consistent. Also, if you're fortunate like me and you have mercury columns, as I mentioned, we're only looking at the average. You're not going to be able to set those dead perfect to a certain height and have them stay there and get them all just dead set. You can see that they're kind of up and down moving. I mean, it's an engine, it's living, it's breathing. It's going to have some fluctuations, so we're trying to get that as dead accurate level as we can. Fortunately, this car, whoever serviced it last, did a great job because these throttles were pretty well dialed in. You know, I took them out of adjustment just to run it back through it and show you guys, but I actually did end up making quite a bit more adjustment from bank to bank than what was done initially to get everything equalized. So the settings I have here are a bit different than what it came in with, but I'm happy with the results. I mean, I was happy with it before I did it, but I'm happy with it now. And the biggest thing, the most important part, is I know that the throttles are synchronized, they're balanced, and the car is correct. So that way, when I give the customer his car back, I have all the confidence that it's done right, done well, and he's going to enjoy it for many more miles to come. All right, so we're finished with the throttle balance. We've already plugged in our idle valve. We've already cleared our faults. So the only things left to do is disconnect our mercury columns, all of our vacuum hoses, and we need to take all of those nipples with the 8 millimeters. I think they're marked as number 5 on our chart. So we need to take all those and screw those back in. If you leave those loose, it's going to be an unmetered air leak, which defeats the whole purpose of what we did. So I'm going to let the engine cool down before I do that, so I can crawl in the wheel wells, get all those hoses off, tighten everything down, seal it up. As for in the center with our linkage, we need to come back and adjust this set screw right here, which again was number 6, and it's the rear one on the other side, just so it barely touches this throttle housing. We're going to do that because that is essentially acting as a throttle stop. Now when I adjust that, I am again going to have the car running so I can watch my mercury columns, and we're going to watch my RPM to be sure that I'm not over tightening it and having an effect on the RPM or the mercury columns, meaning if I tighten it too much, it's going to start to open the throttles. And then the last thing we're going to have to do is come back and adjust our jam nuts on our throttle shaft. Now you can see that I've ran that one in quite a bit. It was pretty loose with quite a bit of slack. I'd say the nuts probably had 3/16 of a gap in between the body of the throttle linkage. So I'm going to adjust those so there's no slack, tighten the jam nut. And once we have that done, we can set our expansion tank down for good. I left the metal hardware and all the spacers for it out because they tend to fall down and I don't want to lose them. So I'll put all the proper hardware in, put the cover on, and really, we just need to get the car put back together the rest of the way now so we can get it back on the road. Well, there you have it. There's the procedure that I use to synchronize and balance the throttles on a 355. Again, I can't really stress this enough. If you break it down into subsystems or smaller segments, it's easy to remember how you do it. You basically have 2 throttle shafts on one bank. You're going to pick the lowest vacuum because we cannot increase vacuum. So the lowest vacuum from the front throttle shaft, which would say on bank 1, cylinder 1 and 2, to the rear shaft, which is 3 and 4. You're going to pick the lowest vacuum on in between 3 and 4 and the lowest on 1 and 2, make a match. Then you're going to use the bleed screws at the top, which is item number 1, and you're going to adjust those to make all the vacuum across the board match. So essentially, after you balance the 2 throttle shafts, you're only going to have 2 bleed screw adjustments that you're going to need to make, where you're going to screw those out, because remember, we start with them all the way in. and you're going to equalize those. It's the same thing on the other bank. Once you've done that procedure on each bank, you're just synchronizing both banks. Now we did have a difference between my two banks at idle, and I made the adjustments on the set screws inside the valley to bring those back down. So now when we revved the engine up and we lost our vacuum, then it started to pull again as it came to idle, everything stayed equal. And now there is one adjustment that I did not talk about that you may need to do if that does not stay equal, and that is on set screw number 4, which is right here listed on bank 2, and you actually access that from the outside and you can get in. And that'll help equalize things as you're running through the RPM, as you're losing vacuum and gaining vacuum. Honestly, that one really needs adjusted. For the most part, everything we did today is about all you need to do. So now we know everything's set on this car. We know our camshaft timing is dead nuts on spec. We know our throttle balance is set. We can give the car back to the client. He can drive it and enjoy it until he feels it's ready for another set of timing belts. Now, I will go through the synchronization again if I am the one to do the timing belts next, because you have to think with all the miles, vibration, heat cycles, those set screws, they're only in there with a small spring to hold them in place. They could start to vibrate and move on us, and we can lose a little bit of adjustment. So my main thing is anytime I work on a car and I return it back to the client, I want to be sure that it's exactly how it should be, as close, or if not better, the factory specs as I can get it. My number one goal is this client can take the car after I serviced it, drive it for a year, 2 years, 3 years. Hopefully all I see it for is annual oil changes, no other big issues, until he feels it's ready for another set of timing belts. Doing the throttle synchronization is one more small step to ensure that he has a pleasurable and enjoyable ownership of the car. Alright, so I hope I explained that in a manner that was easy to follow and made sense to you guys. Honestly, when I film these really technical videos like this, where it's something that I've done frequently, but had not had to really explain along, especially with the cameras around, it kind of splits my attention, and I always worry if I actually did a good job conveying it to you guys. And unfortunately, I won't know for a couple of weeks, because that's how long it takes me to get around to edit these videos. And inevitably, I go through editing and I sit down and I'm, missed the mark. Ooh, could have done better. So, what I'm saying on that is, hopefully this comes across clear, coherent, and made sense to you guys. If not, jump in the comments and let me know, because the way things are looking, I do have another 355 major service on the docket, and well, we're going to be going back through that throttle balance on that other car here in a couple months. So give me some feedback. Let me know what you thought of this video. If there's areas I need to elaborate on more, get camera angle in more, show it better, because I can change it up. We can do this again on the other car and really fill any gaps that we may have had in this video. With that being said, guys, I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching the video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the video. More importantly, get in the comments. Let me know what you thought. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.